Welcome back to Five on the Floor in the Five Reasons Sports Network. Now we're going to do one of our regular segments. We do this with our friend Eric Brown. You can find him at fivereasonsrealtor.com. That's Five reasonsrealtor.com if you're looking to buy or sell a property in South Florida. This is the place to go, but he also helps us out from a Heat perspective. Longtime Heat season ticket holder, follows the team closely, and he does our value play segment where at times he puts me on the spot. Eric, what you got for me this week?
Before we talk about specifically basketball, buying and selling, and I think this applies to the Heat situation. You want to sell when everybody's buying, and you want to buy when everyone's selling. So let's remember that as far as how that applies to the market, not only for homes, but for any assets, and specifically basketball assets. I wanted to ask you, quite frankly, isn't there an inherent problem with the strategy that the Heat embarked on this year? And namely, I'm referring to the fact that last year we had all these young players, and everyone was together. We're all about the Heat culture. And then this year, the second that Myers Leonard was signed to a $9 million contract, it was obvious that was a contract that was to be bundled with the lower cost players, namely the younger ones, that were going to be traded out of town for Giannis or possibly Bradley Beal. So I want to understand, how do you sell that? I'm a young player. How do you sell that to me? And how does you think that sits with me when I'm supposedly buying into the Heat culture? We sacrifice for one another. We go the extra mile. We're a special franchise. But I know you're going to dump me as soon as a suitable whale is identified.
That's one of the problems the organization has always kind of had because of their aspirations. And, it hasn't been as much of an issue when they haven't had sort of accumulated young assets, but when they have, that's always been a problem. I mean, for years, that first year, Josh Richardson and Justice Winslow, were a core part of, it's particularly Winslow, but Richardson later in the year, of that 15-16 team. But as time went on, both of them kind of got mentioned repeatedly as trade assets. And I think it got to both of them at times. And I think it got to this group too. When we had George Sedano on, and he talked about what happened with the Lakers a couple of years ago, when all the talk was, how are they going to get Anthony Davis, and which of their 4 or 5 young pieces were they going to move? They ended up moving 3 of them. But in the interim, it really affected a lot of those players, particularly Brandon Ingram. And, it's just one of those things that to a certain degree becomes unavoidable when you have a team president or in LA's case, LeBron, is basically their team president, even though he's not, or a Pat Riley, who is always going for championships because that you're always ultimately expendable. It's one of the reasons why, I didn't really love the Heat culture and Heat lifer designations that the teams always used, because it's too high a standard. I mean, to say someone is a Heat lifer, but then Dwayne Wade walks away, that doesn't mean a whole lot at that point. And Heat culture, I get the premise of it. I understand stability in the organization, continuity, hard work, toughness, and all of that. They're all good principles to embody. But ultimately, business gets in the way. And when you're playing for a Pat Riley team, you are always expendable. And I think that's the balance. It's between sentimentality and expendability. And in that case, sometimes Pat has gone too close to the sentimental road, such as, bringing back the 06 champions the next year, or, bringing back, at high cost, a lot of the 16-17 team the next year for long-term contracts. It's a tough balance, but I do think it has affected this team. It's hard for me to say, Eric, exactly how much, because I'm not around them like I typically would be, where I'd be able to get a better idea. When I'd be in the locker room and talking to guys, we don't get that kind of access. But just from talking to people who are around the team, it doesn't have quite the same feel that it did last season, either before the bubble or in the bubble. So it's a cost of doing business. Pat's not going to shy away from going for the next big thing, but he tried to straddle the line, Eric. He talked about running it back, but we're always looking for the next thing. I mean, those are mixed messages, but that's part of the deal.
It's if these guys had 3 or 4 years in the league and they were young players and they knew who they were or what they were going to become. But Tyler Hero, Duncan Robinson, Precious Achua, Casey Okpala, they don't know what they are. So when you're trying to develop and establish yourself, and at the same time somebody's basically indicating that you're expendable, that's got to work on your confidence. I mean, there's something's off this with this team, and I'm just suggesting that at least in part might be contributing to it.
Yeah, I think it played a role, particularly with Tyler early. I think you saw Tyler trying to do too much. And I think he's gotten better when they've taken things off his plate, but also the Harden trade happened without him in it, right?
Yes.
So I think that probably took off pressure. And until Bradley Beal announces that he wants out of Washington, which I don't think is happening anytime soon, then Tyler is not necessarily a piece that's going to get moved. And again, even the way I phrased it, a piece that's going to get moved. I think, it's not just us. It's more than us. It's the fans on social media. It's Heat Twitter. The players see that stuff, and every time that Kendrick Nunn has a good game now, people are sending him to Washington or Houston. It's it's tough for these guys, and it has not been an easy situation. But again, I don't know the alternative. I mean, they're always going to go for the bigger player. It's the way that Pat operates. I don't think anybody would want it any other way, but the people who get kind of sacrificed in the deal are those guys. And I know you wanted to get to the Heat's contention window a little bit. What do you have on that?
Yeah, last week we debated whether this team was one major acquisition away from opening a legitimate championship window, or whether they're a young team that was building towards opening a championship window in a year or two. And then I heard Nekias Duncan last night. And if you folks haven't listened to that podcast, you really should. It was extremely informative. He's very knowledgeable. And I think that he had a lot of very interesting observations. He said that, among other things, the Heat's greatest need is a three-level scorer. He said also in passing that Jimmy Butler is a one-level scorer. And he also said that if you were to trade for Zach LaVine or John Collins, you'd probably have to give those guys a year or two to reach their peaks and then make another move. And oh, by the way, you'd probably have to get Jimmy Butler to sign off on that. Jimmy's 31, and if it's 2 years, it's going to be 33 before they make that next move. I thought that those comments basically said to me that if you don't get Bradley Beal, because he's the only three-level scorer that I know of that could potentially be on the market anytime in the near future, and that's if you could even get him. If you don't get him, then you're looking at something that puts you more into that second category of a young team that's developing and going to open a championship window in a year or two.
It's a great point. And what you also got to understand is Nekias comes from the place of being a Heat fan, so he's not necessarily going to be critical for the sake of being critical. I think what we've seen this year a little bit, and one comment that I think really stuck out to me on Twitter, I've mentioned this on the podcast, somebody who responded and said basically that the Heat are suffering in part because Eric Spoelstra did such a good job last year, that it's reminiscent of the 16-17 team where Eric got essentially by designing sort of the perfect offense for a group. In that case, it was the drive and kick game. In this case, it was the dribble handoff game primarily. That essentially he was so far out ahead of the league that the Heat's talent looked better than it was. And then you pay for it the next year when teams start to catch up. And I think we've seen some of that. And I think the very fact that we could have Nekias on and we could say to him, what do they need most? A three-level scorer, a core piece next to Bam, or a point guard? And essentially his answer is kind of all three.
Yes.
Uh, I think it tells you how sort of far away maybe they are and in a way that we didn't think they were. Now, Harden would have been the three-level scorer. The problem is in that trade, you would have had to give up everything else that would have prohibited you from essentially filling the other two needs. They have to find a way to kind of thread the needle here where they can add all three without completely gutting the future and the entire roster. And I'm not exactly sure how they're going to do that. I mean, that basically means you need a John Collins, right, the player next to Bam. You need a Kyle Lowry, the point guard, and you need a three-level scorer, a Bradley Beal. You're not going to get all three, okay, at that level. So it's where do you settle beneath them? Maybe Rudy Gay becomes the stand-in option, as the player next to Bam, or maybe there's a DJ Augustine type who can be the point guard. You're not going to get high-level guys at all three spots. I think the question is, how do you prioritize? How do you get as close as you can get? But then when you look around the league, is that even going to be enough? And I think that we've sort of seen this year that maybe it wouldn't be.
All right. Well, that allows us to transition very nicely to the interview that I want to have now with GM coach Skolnick, who is a distant blood relative of GM Bill Belichick. And for you listeners that maybe didn't hear before, Coach Sko, as we call him, he's a heartless guy. He cares only about winning a championship. Loyalty, kindness, empathy, they don't enter into any calculation he makes. I mean, he's Scrooge at Christmas. He doesn't give kids, candy at Halloween. So all he wants to do is win a championship. So with that in mind, Coach Sko,
yes,
I want to ask you this. Since I think we've Ethan and I have agreed that the Heat really have some needs that have to be filled before they can really open up a legitimate championship window. How do we fulfill those needs? So if we're going to trade for a three-level scorer, particularly if it's a Bradley Beal, we probably need to accumulate some more assets. Mm-hmm. So the first asset that first place I see us acquiring an asset is, and I mentioned this to you last time, Goran Dragic for protected first. Mm-hmm. That was Nikias Duncan was for that as well. So what do you say, Coach Sko?
Well, Adam Borai, who goes by Clutch with us, he's the one who actually pitched that on our pod as well a week ago. I would be reluctant, very reluctant. I don't think that's typically the way you should deal with players of that caliber. And
you're Coach Sko, you're not Ethan.
I understand. No, I understand that, but I also think organizationally it can be bad policy to basically cut bait on a guy like that, because I do think other free agents notice that, and I think it can be detrimental. With that being said, if you're talking about asset accumulation, I would have to look seriously at it. I think that the first guy I would ask about it is Jimmy Butler. I would not make that move without consulting Jimmy. I think that could backfire badly if he is not in on the plan, and why that's a necessity to do that at this stage. He may tell you no, and then you have a hard decision to make, but you better ask Jimmy. But my lean there is, again, depending on the standings, if it looks like it does now, which you're not that far out, but you're not playing well, I would look seriously at doing it, yes.
I just want to point out that I'm a big Goran fan, and I understand why the fan base is so fond of him. But he's been here 7 years. They did just give him $19 million this year, which is, I think, an overpay to some degree. It's not like, they took advantage of him. I think he did take a little bit of a pay cut, if I remember, in the original contract. But I think they've made that up and then some. So to send him on to a Boston or a Philadelphia or a Dallas, I mean, that's not terrible. I mean, I don't really see that as abusing someone.
No, I don't either. I think, again, consultation with him about where he would go, and consultation with Jimmy about how he feels about it. I think both of those things are necessities.
All right. And as a talent evaluator, I wanted to ask you, does Duncan Robinson have more value as a re-sign player to trade later, even at that lower number that, again, Nikias mentioned last night, 14 to 17 million? Or would you rather have a first round draft pick for him now?
Wow, that's a tough one.
Because it gets you out of having to pay him, let somebody else pay him, and
right.
if you get a future asset, because
but you added the caveat as you potentially could trade him later, and I'm just trying to process whether or not that would be possible. In most cases, I think most of the time when we talk about you get a contract to trade the player later, you don't end up getting value for the player when you do that. That's what we heard about when they signed those James Johnson,
Yeah.
Dion Waiters, Kelly Olynyk deals. And the reality is Kelly's still here in part because he was never really completely tradable. They basically had to give Dion and JJ away, and were happy to do so at that point without getting real value. So, although actually they did pretty well in that trade because they did get Iguodala and Crowder back during that whole sequence, but I, you know, but they had to part with Justice. So I, I'm always dubious on the sign a guy and you can move him later part. I mean, sometimes that helps make a deal work because the numbers end up getting to a high enough level where you can match. But I would say right now, if I would take a first round pick, I don't know. I think this is a cop out. I think it depends kind of where the team is. I think if it's a top 15 pick in this upcoming draft, would I take it? Yes, because this is going to be a very strong draft. After the top 15, even as well as the Heat have drafted, it becomes a crapshoot. And I would say no. So I'm going to split the difference there.
Okay. And the last one, which we talked around a little bit around last time, if you can't get Beal and you do sign a Collins or a Zach LaVine or somebody else that has to spend a couple years developing, and also let's not forget that Bam needs to spend a few more years developing. We discussed last time that you don't win with youth. You don't win a title with youth in the NBA, and that's still true. It didn't change from February 8th when we recorded. Still a truism. If you actually go and do that, would you consider seriously trading Jimmy Butler? And let me just again remind you, he's a one-level scorer. And Nikias said he was a two-level scorer. Now he's a one-level scorer, which he didn't say his game dropped off. He just said the shot's not there. But that's another way of saying his game has dropped off. He's going to have to give a couple years before these other guys are ready. And if we don't get Beal, somebody else is going to get, somebody else will have gotten Beal. And the losers in that auction could be open to giving us some picks and maybe a young player for Jimmy Butler that you could use along with LaVine or Collins and Bam to build to that championship.
I would not trade Jimmy Butler. Um, to me, and I know I'm not supposed to be sentimental here, but to me, again, as a business decision, as an organizational business decision, it's a bad decision to trade a guy that you sold on the culture, brought in here, and performed to that level, and then to move him. I understand the fear about further decline. I mean, I think the decline Nikias is talking about is kind of a weird decline. I don't really know why the jump shot is gone, but it has been. There's no way to argue otherwise. It's gone. But he has improved so much in other areas to compensate for it. And even Nikias said that he's really good at that one level, whether it's getting to the rim, post up, or getting to the line, that it's compensated for it. And he's still playing at an elite level defensively. And so to me, I mean, you're 3 years out. I mean, at this point, 2.5 years out from the end of that contract. You can see it from here. And I think one of the things that's been overstated about Jimmy is the minutes. I mean, Jimmy had a lot of seasons he only played 60 games. And so the minutes have not accumulated on him the way they have, say, a LeBron. LeBron's a freak of nature, obviously, but look what he's doing at 36. And LeBron has played many, many, many more playoff minutes than Jimmy has. So I think you're in with Jimmy until the last year of his contract. I think in the last year of his contract, if they haven't gotten to a championship, you may owe it to Jimmy to try to move Jimmy. Okay, if that contract is movable. But right now, would I trade Jimmy Butler? I would not even entertain the thought. No.
Uh, I just want to remind you that Butler relies on his athleticism. And LeBron, like you said, while a freak of nature, he's never shot the three better than he has now. And the
Right.
players that have this kind of durability are normally the ones that can shoot from the perimeter, they can last a real long time.
But I will give you the caveat to this before we close. The caveat to that was Dwayne. And the question is, can Jimmy mold his game in a way that Dwayne did with the old man tricks and all the rest of that? Because Dwayne never became, he tried towards the end of his career, but never became, even a serviceable 3-point shooter. He was if I need one, get one occasionally, but sometimes he went to it too often. But Dwayne's athleticism pretty much went away, and he didn't get to the line as often as he did before, which is still something that Jimmy's doing. And yet he still found a way to be effective. So to me, it's more Jimmy becoming more of a magician in the post and developing some of that other stuff. But I do think defensively, he can play at an elite level. I mean, Andre Iguodala can't do it all the time, but Andre Iguodala is 2 years older or 3 years older than Jimmy will be at the end of that contract. He's still a good defender. I don't have any doubt that Jimmy can be a good defender. Can he be a leading scorer on a team at that age? Maybe not. But I don't think it's good. It's good business policy to even entertain moving Jimmy Butler for the next year at the very least.
Unless he asks.
Unless he asks, which he's not. Which I can tell you, it's a good way to close because I've had this on Twitter and he's not asking. He likes it here. He still likes it here. He's still comfortable with the organization. That's not going to happen. Okay, at least not for the next year or two.
Okay, Coach Sko. I think you're softer than your relative.
I think so too, but I think I'm taking organizational concerns into consideration. All right, 5reasonsrealtor.com. Talk heat with him. Obviously, if you're looking to buy or sell a property, this is the place to go. Eric, we really appreciate the time. We'll do it again next week.
My pleasure. Thank you.